So let's jump right in and just define our terms. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is cognitive bias and what are its functions?
Sure. Cognitive bias, in the most basic sense, it's a term that means preferences we have for making decisions that introduce what you might think of as predictable errors. When we make decisions, we tend to use shortcuts because we make tons of decisions every day. And some of those decisions require a lot of deep thinking, and some of them we try to do more efficiently and quickly. And that's often where we see cognitive biases come into play, is when we're using quick term decision making rather than doing the more what some people call system two thinking versus system one. System one is the short, fast decision. System two is the more thorough and logic-based rational decision making.
So cognitive biases come more into play with these fast decisions. Can you say more about what you mean by predictable errors?
Well, we all are susceptible to cognitive biases. And so I'll give you for instance here. When you think about an error that people tend to make a lot, all of us are afraid of losing things. There's a very common bias called loss aversion. And we sink a little bit of money into something, and then it starts going in the wrong direction. And we feel like, oh my gosh, I better put a little more in to try and shore up my investment here. And we're more scared of losses than is rational sometimes. Sometimes it's best to cut our losses, but loss aversion is a perfect example of a kind of very common bias that is predictable. People do this all the time. They have a house that's losing value, and rather than just saying, you know what, this one's not coming back, and cutting their losses, they'll hold on and hold on and hold on while continuing to incur further losses. That's a simple example.
That makes sense. So this loss aversion, that is an example of how a bias might affect how we make decisions. Engineers make an enormous number of decisions that can be around decisions around assessing risk or analyzing data or trying to generate solutions to problems. Can you talk a little bit about how cognitive bias might show up in those decision-making processes?
Sure. Well, loss aversion actually is a perfect example with projects, for instance. If a project in its early phase is off to a bad start, sometimes someone with outside eyes can say, you know what, this thing is not going to turn around. But the people who are invested in the project may feel like, wait, we just need a little bit more time and a little bit more money. And that desire to not take the loss, to absorb that sunk cost, is something that people have a lot of trouble with. Now, another example that you see particularly in a culture like NASA's, is optimism bias. And optimism bias is simply the preference toward thinking that things are going to work out for the best. And we see this often when people are building proposals, when they're scoping proposals and figuring out costs. And look, some of that is, sometimes people know that they're being optimistic and they're kind of playing a game, but other times people genuinely think they can get things done at a certain cost for a project, and it often is predicated on everything going right. And essentially, rather than thinking through things from a worst case scenario, there's a bias toward optimism and can do. So those are a couple of quick examples. A third one is something called anchoring bias. And anchoring is when we get stuck on a number that's the first number introduced into a problem or situation. So if, for instance, if I said to you, do you know if the world's tallest redwood is taller or shorter than 625 feet, you're likely to give an answer that is in some way anchored on 625 feet. And the real answer here is 375 feet. But because the anchor has been introduced in some way, it biases the answer for someone who doesn't have a frame of reference. That's a well-known example by a guy named Daniel Kahneman, who is kind of the godfather of cognitive bias theory and heuristics.
So this anchoring bias it intrigues me because it seems like the first number or the first data point that you might encounter when trying to solve a problem or create a design, that can then affect or bias all your future data collection and perhaps send you in the wrong direction. Do I have that right?
That's absolutely right. And again, cost of proposals is a huge example here when you look at things that have had costs balloon to, they've gone up 200% from the initial proposal. Oftentimes we started with an idea that this was going to cost $100 and ends up costing double that. And that first estimate was the anchor, and people hung up on that. And it just was simply a starting point that was probably arrived at without adequate data to generate a good estimate in the first place. But then it's there and it's part of the conversation, and so we get stuck on it and fix on it in a way that's probably not really speaking to what the facts or the data might support.
Excellent. During the course of today's session, we're going to talk about the ways in which biases can be helpful and ways in which they can be not so helpful. It seems to me that although the first step with you, with making sure that the bad bias is less impactful and good bias is more impactful, is noticing bias. Can you give us some advice about how we might go about noticing when cognitive biases are in play?
Well, like you said, part of it is being aware of them. Part of it is knowing the vocabulary of biases, knowing about a bunch of different kinds of biases, and then using tools that can help to protect or to guard against biases. And NASA does some of this already. For instance, a few years ago, NASA adopted something called joint confidence levels when programs and projects are figuring out how well they think they can meet a targeted schedule and budget. And it's saying, how confident are you that you can actually achieve what you say you can achieve? And that's in some way asking people to re-examine the assumptions they made and say, no one's 100% confident they can do something exactly like they said. So are you 50% confident? Are you 70% confident? Are you only 10% confident? And if you're taking that second step there of assessing confidence level, that's an interesting way of doing this. Now, another way that a lot of NASA teams will do this kind of thing is they'll red team ideas, or murder boards, as they're affectionately known, where you get experts who are outside of a project or a team to look at your ideas with fresh eyes and say, you know what, you guys completely overlooked X, Y, or Z. And getting those fresh perspectives is a huge way to help to mitigate biases.
And you earlier started us out when you were defining cognitive bias by talking about predictable, in terms of predictable errors. I imagine that there are patterns that people, organizations, teams tend to go to the same biases over and over and over again. I guess that I'm imagining that as we get better at recognizing them once, we're more likely to catch them because they're going to come up more than once.
I think so, and yet the people who have studied this well and who are really the experts, some people think that there's nothing we can do about our biases, that we're doomed, and others say, wait, there are things we can try to do. So take, for instance, groupthink, which is pretty well known as a bias, and that is when people are all working on something together and they've finally converged around answers, they tend to move in the same direction. That's an example of a bias that's pretty well known, and there have been examples from NASA history where you could argue that groupthink was a powerful force in terms of people staying the course in one direction as opposed to another when they might have asked more challenging questions. Being aware of it is important. Having outside opinions or even channels for people to offer dissenting opinions when social pressure is such that it's difficult to do that. Those are examples of the things that you can try to do to counter those recurring and predictable biases. So groupthink is a social bias that involves lots of people. There are also these one-on-one biases, of course, and knowing your own proclivities in some way is, knowing thyself. Thine own self is a helpful part of that.
And this is a nice segue to my next question. You've already started. I've heard of groupthink as an example of bias in a negative form, a negative way of bias appears. Are there ways that we can mitigate the negative effects of bias once we're aware of these things showing up?
Well, there are some tools. I mentioned red teaming and getting dissenting opinions. And, one of the most interesting things I've heard around groupthink is this idea called a pre-mortem. And a psychologist named Gary Klein came up with this several years ago. And he said, if your group's converging on an answer and you've kind of worked through everything and you're marching toward the decision, it's a good time to do an exercise as a group to pause and write a letter to the group as though it were a year later and say, now you've made this decision and it's gone horrendously wrong. Why did it go horrendously wrong? Explain all the ways in which it went horrendously wrong. And that's a really powerful exercise because it forces you to start thinking about to re-examine that group think. And it also gives the pessimists a voice. If the pessimists were feeling like they couldn't speak up because of social pressure at that point, this might actually give them that opportunity to say, oh, you know what? Now's my chance to really lay it on, and I've got a safe space to do that, and it's within the context of this activity. So that's a really interesting and growing technique that's being used for this, the pre-mortem. I love the name too. It's not post-mortem, it's a pre-mortem.
I like this idea of a pre-mortem in that it sounds like it expands the space for dialogue and the space for imagination to be applied towards the problem or the issue at hand.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
That works it sounds like that could be effective at a team level or an organizational level. Do you see any differences in terms of techniques that might be used at an individual level with people? If I personally wanted to do a better job of mitigating the negative effects of biases that I have?
You know, I think on a personal level, I think we all have tendencies. I think you and I were corresponding about this a little before the session. And, you know, some people are more prone to be concerned about loss aversion than others. Some are overly optimistic. And it's really knowing the way that you see the world and, you know, are on guard against your unique biases that come up over and over again. I mean, I'll give you a simple example from my own life. I've been trying to be very diligent and rational and almost sort of textbook by the way I've been managing my personal investments. And so at the beginning of the year, I put some money into a retirement account because I knew it was the time of year I was going to do this, and I was working according to plan, which is the way you're supposed to do this stuff if you follow the best advice that's out there right now based on the best available data. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, the markets go down a couple thousand points, and I think, oh my gosh. And yet, if I were to to do anything, I would probably be playing into exactly that kind of a loss aversion bias, and it would be a mistake. And it's a matter of, in my case, sort of holding my, taking a deep breath and saying, okay, I'm in this for the long term, and knowing that it's long term thinking. That's a simple example, but it's knowing the kind of things that you personally tend to err on the side of where your biases are concerned. And I think in that case, it's really just worth learning more about this whole field of bias. I mean, it's exploded over the past couple decades, and there's a lot of good information out there to learn more about this.
It seems like we're not only susceptible to bias at an individual level, but also not so great at recognizing our own biases. Why are we so bad at this?
Again, it goes to making decisions quickly and habitually, as opposed to being able to do everything as hyper-rational beings. We love to think of ourselves as supremely rational, but the truth is we just don't behave that way day in and day out. And sure, some people are probably better at it than others, but all of us fall prey to this at some level or another, or it's arguable that all of us have these kinds of biases.
So that's a little sort of an eye-opener for me, that I had always assumed that cognitive biases are equally at play at all times. It sounds like they might be more in play in times when I feel pressure to move quickly, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. When you're under stress, you have to make decisions faster, and stress also constricts your bandwidth, so to speak, your cognitive bandwidth. And there's a lot of research about the effects that stress have on decision making, and people who are under more stress tend to make worse decisions. And I don't mean everyone who's under stress. Some people are better at managing that stress than others, but there's a lot of research to suggest that people who are under stress are going to make quicker and decisions that are more prone to mistakes than people who have the time to really reflect on things and figure out the pros, the cons, and really work the angles.
Now, that's a good lead into my next question then, because I'd always assumed that I'm one of those people who thrives under pressure. I may be and it sounds like I may be producing effectively, but maybe not necessarily making the best decisions under pressure. Are there other things that people tend to get wrong about this whole topic about cognitive bias?
Well, you know, I mean, the biases introduce error. And that's in some way the foundational way to think about it is if your biases are introducing error, where are they introducing error? And, you know, where have you seen the consequences of those errors? And, you know, one thing that can be a helpful technique, you mentioned that on the personal level, one thing that I was told to do years and years ago, and now that I think about it, it's a good suggestion here, is to keep a journal of your decision making and to keep score of yourself essentially, and notice how often you get things right and how often you get them wrong, and be diligent about it. This is like your golf score. You have it's an honor code or honor system. You have to be honest with yourself about how you're doing, because you will make better decisions by tracking how well you make decisions. So in some way, I think that might be something of a response to the question you asked, if not a direct answer.
Yeah. So I'm not going to try. I'm not trying to be trite, but it sounds like as humans, we're all prone to bias.
Mm-hmm.
And the first step is developing some level of awareness of what types of biases that we use. And perhaps one way of developing that awareness regularly is to, like as you said, keep score, keep a journal of our decisions.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, I'll just give you one last thought about that, which is success can breed bias too. Because when we do things right and we have the validation of getting it right, we think, oh, well, that worked. We'll do that again. And we, you know, engineering, a lot of engineering education in recent years, you know, Henry Petrosky is probably the most ardent advocate on this point, that, you know, when we have success, it sets the stage for failure, because we're blinding ourselves. It's a little bit, maybe it introduces a little bit of that optimism bias. Oh, well, it worked before, it's going to work again, even though the context is different and we didn't know what we didn't know the first time. And that warm glow of success makes us think, yeah, that worked great. I'll do that one more time. And so that's the kind of thing that you want to watch for. And it's also where the journal can be useful, because then you're tracking the decisions. You say, oh, I got that one right. Oh, wait. And so over time, the journal becomes really important. It's not something that's helpful over a month. It's helpful over years.